Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started here momentarily. Thank you for being here. I'm Jim Porter, and on behalf of the World Trade Center, Utah, the UVU National Security Studies Institute, I should say, the Gary Herbert Policy Institute, and of course Strider, we welcome you to our panel today, Navigating a New Era of Economic Statecraft. We're pleased to be joined by Ricky Gill, who is the former director for Russia at the NSC. He's going to be moderating our panel today, and we'll introduce the other partners. Please take notes, listen. This is going to be an exciting panel. We saved the best for last. Ricky, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Can everybody hear me? Great. Well, welcome to the panel on Navigating a New Era of Economic Statecraft. We really have an esteemed group of panelists. So I'd like to go through their bios initially, and then I'm going to frame out what the conversation is going to be, and then without further ado, we'll hit some questions. I do want to thank my panelists for helping me prepare for this discussion. We coordinated in advance, so hopefully you find this to be fruitful. Let me start with Eric Levesque, who's seated to my right. Eric is the co-founder and chief operating officer of Strider, which is a tech startup working with corporations and government agencies to secure their innovation. Prior to Strider, Eric led technology investments at Oman's Investment Authority and served on the board of Teal Drones. Also, Strider is, of course, a sponsor, so we're very grateful to Eric. Liza Tobin is sitting to my immediate left. She's a former colleague of mine from the National Security Council. Liza is currently the Senior Director of Research and Analysis for Economy at the Special Competitive Studies Project. And immediately prior to that, she served on the National Security Council as the China Director. Before that, she's had an illustrious career in government. She served as an economic analyst at the CIA and was also an advisor to the United States Military Indo-Pacific Command on China issues. And then last but certainly not least is Damien Ma. Damien is the founding managing director of Macro Polo, the think tank of the Paulson Institute. He's authored several books, including In Line Behind a Billion People, How Scarcity Will Define China's Ascent in the Next Decade. And he's got a faculty appointment at Northwestern University, so we're grateful for him too. Let me share with you a definition of economic statecraft that we all compiled in advance, just so we kind of have some parameters for what this concept means. You know, from my State Department and NSC experience, it seems that economic statecraft is certainly surging in importance in the foreign policy toolkit. I think we all acknowledge that. So our formulation of economic statecraft for this discussion is the use of economic tools, inclusive of trade, investment, and aid, to pursue political or foreign policy ends and or shape the political choices of other nation states. So that's kind of the world we're going to be inhabiting for the next hour or so, if you can tolerate us. Liza was astute enough to refine this further and say that we're going to have different strata of economic statecraft that's going to come out of today's discussion. You're going to see a global discussion where there's competition between China and the United States in different parts of the world. So maybe that's global and regional. Think about Europe, think about Latin America, places where our influence may rub up against certain Chinese influences. There are going to be bilateral components to the discussion. Damien was presiding over a panel earlier where there was discussion about trade deficits, which have been a persistent feature of the relationship. So there's going to be a bilateral element. And then there's going to be a local subnational element. And that's very topical for Utah, right? State governments, universities, organizations, institutions that may or may not have an official imprimatur but play a role. So just keep that in mind. My first question is going to be to Liza. Liza has a very unique experience because she served on the National Security Council staff under two presidents, under President Trump and President Biden. And so my question to Liza is, can you get us up to speed on U.S. policy on China? We've obviously detected a seismic shift. Talk to us about what the policy was under Barack Obama, how it evolved significantly under President Trump, and how it's being maintained in its current trajectory today.
Thanks so much, Ricky, and thank you so much to our conference hosts. It's wonderful to be here in Utah, get out of Virginia for a few days, and get to see this beautiful state. So thank you so much for having us. As Ricky mentioned, I experienced this paradigm shift in U.S. China relations, both in the White House, but just I think to fully understand it, we have to kind of take it back and look at what led up to this. So I lived through it both personally and in my career. Personally, my grandmother is Chinese American, so I'm a quarter Chinese. I started studying Chinese right before college and then after. And when I was living over in China during, I think, the heyday of positive U.S.-China relations in the early 2000s, there was a lot of hope for the future of U.S.-China relations, and I wanted to be part of that, part of building the educational exchange and all of the different forms of exchange between our two countries. But as Ricky noted, there's been a seismic shift recently, and I got to live through it. So as he mentioned, I was working at the White House as China director from 2019 to last November 2021. And really what I saw in that time and participated in was a shift from 40 years of U.S. policy towards China being premised on an assumption or maybe a hope of engagement and bringing China gradually into the existing international order, and the hope that this would moderate their behavior and lead to change, perhaps not turning them into a full democracy, but making their economy more market-oriented, and I think more critically, making their political system more pluralistic. But I think what American policymakers missed in a lot of that was the fact that the Chinese Communist Party has agency. They have a choice in the matter. So I think if you pay attention to what the Chinese Communist Party says, Xi Jinping and others, it's quite clear that they have very clear ambitions to become the world's leading nation in all different respects. So technology, economy, military, politics, culture, really everything. There isn't really any major domain of human existence where they haven't set their sights on proving that the Chinese Communist Party's system of governance is superior to what we have here in the West of democracy and capitalism. So I think the evidence of this was mounting in the 2010s in the Obama administration. Policymakers were aware they were seeing problems on the economic front, despite many, many high-level dialogues where American and Chinese policymakers sat down and tried to work out the problems that some of you in business may have experienced: IP theft, cyber attacks, unfair trade practices. Many, many, many hours of hundreds of dialogues to try to come up with agreements. We would come up with a lot of, commitments on paper, sign the dotted line, and consistently China underperformed in actually fulfilling those commitments, despite, some market openings and certainly some opportunities for American businesses along the way. Politically, of course, we've seen an increase in repression, most notably with the genocide that is happening on our watch right now in Xinjiang. Really, it's quite remarkable that all of us are living through a modern day genocide enabled by a high-tech surveillance state. So this is not some kind of backward country in the third world. This is a very high-tech, wealthy country that is committing genocide against their own people. And then, of course, on the military side, we see increasing Chinese aggression, not only in their region, in the Indo-Pacific, but around the world. And it's now public knowledge out in the papers that they have a strategy to establish a global network of military bases to challenge the United States. So, I think the last gasps of this kind of assumption or policy of hope in change was when the Obama administration prioritized cooperation on climate change with China. And of course, this makes a lot of sense. We're the two biggest countries. They're the number one emitter. We're the number two. We need to work together to get this right. And so they prioritized that above all other things in U.S. China policy, stopped talking about the military aggression, stopped talking about the human rights, and said, let's get the Chinese into the Paris Accord. They did that successfully. China joined the Paris Accords. Of course, their track record in implementing the commitments has been underwhelming. But still, it was that hope that by bringing them into the system that their behavior would change. So then the Trump administration comes in, tests these assumptions and says we need to start with new assumptions, look at the world how it is, not how we wish it would be, and really kind of abandon the assumption of engagement causing change within China, and really realizing the limits of American statecraft, the limits of American ability to change another country's governance system or to really influence their behavior from the bottom up. And so that introduced the concept of strategic competition, viewing the U.S. China relationship primarily through a lens of competition rather than cooperation, although I think some areas of cooperation should and do remain. Then, what was most interesting was waiting to see what the new Biden team would do. Would they, repudiate and abandon this Trump administration approach? In fact, no. They came in, and my my new bosses in the Biden administration didn't fire me, for one thing, and they said we are going to continue the same direction of policy, strategic competition. They made some adjustments. They said we need to be doing more with allies and partners, and we need to be doing more to invest in our own competitiveness. So perhaps we can get into a little bit more of the forward-looking perspective later on. I'll stop there. Thanks.
That's great. Really terrific insights. I was struck, before I get to you, Eric, I was struck by something I had heard before, but the point was reiterated over the course of the last day and a half, that right after Tiananmen, there was kind of a decision in the elite cadre of the Chinese Communist Party that the United States will remain will be a primary geopolitical adversary. And so that decision was made decades ago. I don't know if that dawned on the audience, but just putting a pin in that, it kind of elevates the importance of economic statecraft. So with that in mind, Eric, I wanted to ask you, what's the role of industry in economic statecraft, the formulation of it, in strategic competition? How is industry grappling with this geopolitical framework, and what can our government do to assist these changes? Because we sometimes are not as kinetic, and we are sometimes not really hospitable to state support the way Chinese and Russian state entities are.
Yeah. First off, Liza, thank you for framing that. I think she's absolutely correct in that every aspect of society, of the global economy, technology, diplomacy, every vector of engagement is a vector of competition today. Actually, I would also say that in every vector, other than as Ricky just mentioned, other than kinetic, we are at a crossroads. I think we are engaged in, for all intents and purposes, war in all of those vectors. In the global economy, one of the things that I want to just frame for us here real quick, my whole career has been in the private sector. I want to provide some perspective of actual events that took place over the last 5 years. As you think about what's happening at a macro level geopolitically, the fourth industrial revolution is creating massive shifts in terms of how we use technology to live our lives, conduct business, and the way that governments operate. Enabling a national surveillance system is technology enabled. That has major implications for business, for society, and also for investors. I think we are now seeing for the first time in decades this resurgence, and this was brought up on a prior panel. What are our values? What values should businesses have? What values should investors have? And how do those get incorporated into decisions that are made? So when you think about that industrial revolution, you can see, and actually this is in the Communist Party policy documents, when you have those shifts take place, it creates geopolitical windows of opportunity. If you can identify those technological shifts and position yourself to be a leader in them, you can leapfrog geopolitically. And if you can marry that with the ambition that you have for your place in the world, then you can skip generations and make those advancements. I think that's what's happening right now. And it's not just the US, it's not just China. If we want to go through other countries, Japan has a very well thought out economic statecraft policy. They even have a Minister of Economic Security that they just created. I lived in Oman and worked for the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Oman. They also have a policy that is geared towards their economic statecraft objectives. Oman Vision 2040, Saudi Arabia has it, France has it in regards to AI, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the framework. As you operate at the business level and you're thinking about going into, let's just, for this discussion, the China market, you are going to run into major difficulties from the private market side and the public market side. And I just wanted to, and I think Damien also has a lot of expertise in this. I think this will help with the discussion here. When we went out and did an assessment of the technology growth and development in China, which is impressive, right? There is a desire, if you're an investor, right, you want to go where you can invest capital and generate a return, right? And if you have companies that are developing the next gen technologies, that creates opportunity. That is how business works. You respond to market conditions, there are incentives in place, and there are regulations and laws that you have to comply with. But beyond that, in the United States, you're free to go and make your investment decisions where you think the risk-reward calculus makes sense. I will say over the last 5 years, that calculus has fundamentally shifted. The cost-benefit analysis has shifted. And I think that for the first time you are seeing, as Liza was talking about with the government policies that are coming into place, industry's on board. I don't think 6, 7 years ago, or certainly right after the financial crisis, industry was on board. But I have seen both in the investment community, again, I'll focus more on the private market side, and in corporate America and in European corporates, a desire to understand what the role of government is going to be over the next 10 years in establishing this economic statecraft policy and actually supporting those government policies as it relates to Western values, which they believe are under threat. So I just wanted to frame that. I'll pause there, but the last thing I did want to mention is that I also believe that the opportunity that we have here is technology can create transparency. And I think that as we talk about data privacy, as we talk about supply chains, one of the issues that we've seen a lot in the investment community is the inability to get transparency in the Chinese domestic market. There are publicly listed companies that are PLA commercial entities. And we have American investors investing in them. That's not in the disclosures. It's not something that is well known, yet it exists. So I think that's going to be a fundamental issue. And then the last thing I'll just mention is when we did an assessment of deploying capital into China, there were 2 areas that we looked at that were really concerning that actually halted a lot of the activity. And those 2 were, number one, the domestic investment environment is really designed for just that, domestic investors. If you're a foreign investor investing, your ability to access the best deals are very difficult. There's a lot of government capital in private investment funds. And because of that, you have government rules that you have to abide by in terms of getting your capital out. I think that's been an issue for a long time in the investment community, is the inability to get your capital out. It's almost like, and we kind of joked with our colleagues a little bit about this, it's almost like the Hotel California of capital markets. Like once you get in, you're checked in, and how do you get out? That's been an issue that I think that China has inflicted upon itself.
Great point. Damien, I've got a specific question for you, but I have an open question first that's a follow-up to that. And partly it's my Russia background. I'm thinking about the sort of new world, which is partly Eric's background. That's another story for another day. But you're seeing since February 24th, the real decoupling, particularly in the energy market, between Europe and Russia, right, on oil, gas, and some other commodities. And so I have to ask a question about a so-called China plan, a contingency for corporations and companies. I mean, what we've seen over the last couple of months is really remarkable. The energy decoupling, you combine that with the fact that Xi Jinping and Putin announced a partnership without limits on the eve of the invasion. There's obviously a lot more integration in the economies of the West, between the economies of the West and China, but to what extent do you think it's advisable for companies to have contingency operations in place in case there is something that is a triggering event, right? And it could be across the Taiwan Straits. It could be something of that order of magnitude. And is that even conceivable that something like that can be done? What would that look like? What corporate decision making can you kind of sketch out for the audience? And that goes for anybody.
Sure. I mean, I absolutely think you need a China plan. I think you're probably here because you know that already, and maybe you're trying to formulate that now. So I think the private sector is pretty smart. They're generally ahead of the U.S. government in figuring out new trends and starting to innovate to fill those. So yes, I think everybody needs a China plan. I don't personally favor the word decoupling for the U.S.-China relationship. I think what we saw in Russia was incredibly dramatic and rapid in terms of a decoupling between advanced economies and Russia. China, of course, is very different. I find the word decoupling to be very emotional, kind of as if we're in like a marriage or something with China. So I prefer to think of it in terms of the other 3 Ds of U.S.-China trade ties. I think we need to be thinking about de-risking, disentangling, and diversifying. So I think we're all here to learn more about the risks and rewards of the China market, and the risks premium has certainly gone up. This isn't just because of the possibility of a U.S.-China military contingency, but it's also just the steady state things we're dealing with of declining Chinese growth trajectories. They might be in a recession this year. Damien can give us more insights on that. But for all kinds of reasons, I think we need to be thinking about how to do all of these things. And when there are challenges and shifts, as Eric has pointed out, there are also opportunities, and the private sector tends to be way ahead in terms of finding those new markets, those new opportunities, whether it's here in North America or elsewhere in Southeast Asia.
And Damien, you're remarkably vigilant about things that are happening vis-a-vis kind of Chinese economic policy, their statecraft. Can you walk through the audience? What does economic statecraft look like to them? And to what extent is the private sector interacting with the state sector? What's the relative importance of both? And who's giving directives to who?
Sure. If I could also just quickly address some of the broader trends just briefly. On Russia versus China market, I think I opened up the morning session asking if people had made in China products, right? And I'm guessing most of the things in this room are made in China. I'm guessing no one has a made in Russia product. Maybe if you love caviar, you might have a made in Russia product. So I'm saying that is because that makes decoupling with Russia much easier. It's a country that most Europeans view as a gas station, right? It doesn't make things that we consume, and China just makes a lot of things that we consume. So it's a choice that is fundamentally going to be more challenging. And I completely agree with Liza that we need to think about diversification and hedging against the risk. But when you talk to companies, they sort of said, like, we agree, but how do you want us to do this? And who's going to pay for the cost of diversification? And that's a tough question when you're staring at a company who's asking, how much do you want to pay? If this is going to cost $150 million, or let's just hypothetically, who's going to pay for that diversification? Because I like to illustrate this with China has built up, to get to Ricky's question, a really formidable manufacturing ecosystem. I talked about it a little bit this morning, but it is really impressive, and I visited it several times down in Dongguan. The company that makes the iPhone, people don't realize it's 300,000 people. It's larger than the population of Pittsburgh. So you go find a factory that size in the United States. You can't. So, but that's just one example of the impressiveness of the ecosystem they built. And I'll make this simple for you. Who uses the iPhone iOS in here? Raise your hand. Who uses an Android? Who enjoys switching between those two ecosystems? right? We don't even like doing that. Nobody even wants to go from Android to iOS. I don't. And that's how they get you, right? Because when the ecosystem is great, why would you want to actually switch to something else that is good, but it's not anything tangibly better than the other ecosystem? Now, geopolitics, that could really shift things. So I think we're talking about the possible shift happening, but I'm just saying it is actually it's a very tough decision, practically speaking, because humans in general don't like to switch around things if it works really, really well. And China has proven that it's basically done pretty well in terms of producing a lot of the stuff. So it's a much harder choice set from a company level. In fact, I was just teaching at Kellogg yesterday before I came here, and a lot of companies, they kind of asked me, and I brought up a lot of the issues we talked about, and they basically said, we've done our internal research. You can't find me a country that's a good substitute for China right now. And that is the question we need to answer. What is China's substitute? Is it India? Is it Brazil? Is it Russia? What country can step in a year and do that and do what China can do, which is a really tough question. I didn't have a good answer, right? So so quickly to answer your question about economic statecraft, I think we need to distinguish between economic statecraft both behind the border and beyond the border. So China's kind of going out strategy, now it's being called the Belt and Road, but they've been doing it since 2002. They had going out 1.0. That was sort of the mercantilist period where they went out. It was all it was all state-owned enterprises driven, right? They went to Africa, they went to Latin America, they locked down energy resources because China was going through a hyper-industrialization phase. So that was going out 1.0. Belt and Road is a little different. Belt and Road is basically going out 2.0. And that's a lot of that, if you think about the digital component of it, which I think Eric, I'm sure, has looked into it, that a lot of that is actually private sector driven because Chinese tech companies are already competing with American tech companies in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, and also in Europe. So it's no longer sort of, these state-owned enterprises going out there locking down, energy and commodities. It's a different ballgame. And, to the extent that consumers in different countries adopt Chinese tech, they will by definition adopt Chinese standards and norms. And I think that's what's really at stake too. And that's tough because sometimes we don't necessarily have products at the price point that the Chinese do.
Of course.
Right.
One of the questions that comes to mind is, in the foreign policy community in Washington, everybody cites the residual architecture of American alliances as a natural reserve of strength, right? I think we've all heard that. To what extent is this administration focused on buttressing those alliances in the context of what's called friendshoring? Friendshoring meaning we may not be able to bring all this manufacturing here, but part of de-risking may be placing it in countries like India, Thailand, the Philippines,
Japan, South
Vietnam,
Korea.
Japan, although Japan may have cost curve issues, but still would be a place with substantially lower risk premium. So is that an explicit, this is a question for Liza and Damien, is that an explicit goal of the buttressing of alliances? Has that been articulated? And for the audience's benefit, there's something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. My understanding is it was just announced a few weeks ago. Is that a plank?
Sure. Thanks, Ricky. Yeah, I'll try to attack that. So I think what you're getting to is kind of industrial strategy, right? I mean, the Chinese have an industrial strategy. Damien has really portrayed some of the difficulties that business face making these decisions on their own. And I think at a certain point, you have to ask your government, what are you doing for me? What are you doing to help me navigate some of these problems that, some of these shifts are driven by geopolitical trends that are out of the control of private businesses. So I think when you get to issues like diversifying supply chains, reshoring, friendshoring, there is a role for governments and the U.S. working with our allies and partners to identify opportunities and to help lower some of the long-term risks and help offset some of the costs that might impede the private sector from doing it on its own. So, I think just to step back a little bit, I said that companies need a China plan. I think for the U.S. government, the U.S. government needs a China plan as well. The center of the competition with China is in technology. And so it's time, again, to have an industrial strategy that is focused on technology. Industrial strategy used to be kind of a bad word because it sounds like waste, fraud, and abuse. But I think we have to look at our own history and remember that, in fact, we've actually done this well many times. If you go back to the Cold War, the Apollo program, that had tremendous spillover benefits, the creation of the microelectronics industry, Silicon Valley, hundreds of thousands of jobs and innovation and money that came out of that government intervention and government partnership. And this wasn't just a Cold War thing. This was also just as recently as Operation Warp Speed. I was in the White House when Dr. Anthony Fauci, very early in the pandemic, I think around February 2020 or so, said to us, hey, we're going to try to develop vaccines, but it will be a miracle if we develop a vaccine within less than a year. Guess what? Fast forward, I think 10 or 11 months, we had vaccines. That was the U.S. government setting a high bar for private industry, partnering with them, providing some of the funding, and then the private companies, both in the U.S. and Europe, were competing with each other. And whoever got there first and hit these high bars, they were the ones that were rewarded. And so we've done this before. We can do it again. Supply chains can be part of it. In some cases, we should be bringing national security critical production back to the United States. In other cases, it doesn't make sense. And friendshoring and nearshoring and all the other types of shoring might make more sense. I don't know if you want to add,
I actually think, Ricky, that I think friendshoring has some there, in part because we've been looking a lot into what South Korea has been doing. And they've actually made a pretty significant decision to step into the U.S. electric vehicle supply chain. A lot of people think it's because the new president is more pro-U.S. Certainly that might be a little bit of the case, but we looked into it, and it's actually because South Korean companies are just not doing that well in the China market. Hyundai, for example, is their main EV maker. Their market share went from 9% to 2.3%. Samsung, Galaxy, is at a meager less than 1% of market share, compared to Apple, which is 15-16% of the China market share. So Korean companies are getting destroyed in the China market, and they have a more welcoming environment here in the United States. And we've looked at the list of what they promised to invest in battery capacity. They promised to invest in 2025 more battery capacity in the United States than the entire world's global manufacturing capacity this year. Just South Korea alone, right? So I think that's something that America should try to capitalize on.
I'm going to turn to Eric next. Those are terrific answers. Eric, in one of our discussions, you had mentioned that the Chinese have explicitly articulated that data is a new factor of production in terms of how they view productivity. And it begs the question, as industrial policy ceases being a dirty pejorative and starts becoming increasingly germane to the discussion, do we have the ability to negotiate and navigate the creation of industrial policy? Do we have the muscle memory to do this in a data-driven economy, which is very different from where we're coming from?
The government aspect of it, I'll leave to them. I'll just say, I'll go through some of the key technologies that make up the fourth industrial revolution, and then you guys can think about what is the role of data in those. Okay, so virtual reality, robotics, energy, 3D printing, biotechnology, AI, advanced materials, IoT, blockchain. Data makes up almost all of those. There's components of it that, if you want to have some of the best AI algorithms, you have to have great underlying data. If you want to have cutting edge biotechnology, you have to have incredible data. And actually, all of these technologies also create new data, and then you can weave it back in. So when you think about economics traditionally, and we all had this in Econ 101, like the traditional means of production, land, labor, and capital, in a digital world, which we are absolutely moving into, data becomes a means of production. So I actually do think China is ahead on this. They have actually made it part of their government strategy to incorporate data into their means of production. By doing so, however, it means that, as I mentioned earlier, your ability to have transparency is quite limited because it's controlled. The data is controlled. We saw this with a lot of our clients over the last year as the data privacy law in China came out. And there's also a number of data companies that have joint ventures in China that get data from China who are no longer able to do so. I think that this is something that's evolving. It's too early to really say like where that will move over the next couple years. But I do think that the United States government is starting to develop strategies around this. I will tell you, for sure, private industry is recognizing this as a problem, and also recognizing that the world that we're in right now, as data becomes more pervasive, and as just, as Damien, you mentioned, like you have your iPhone, you're creating digital exhaust, like that exists everywhere now. How are we going to harness it? How are we going to use it and do it in the model that we currently have today, which enables for human rights, for the ability of people to control their own data and to use it for how they see fit, to have private industry use it under the conditions that are set out, but not have it at the government level that is used to direct all of the state objectives in both industry and in society. I think that's where today, like that debate, I have not heard that broadly, and I think that it's time that we start having that discussion. As it relates to like what will the government response be, and if we have that muscle memory from, as Liza was talking about, prior industrial policy periods in the United States, yeah, I'll ask you that. I don't have a handle on that one personally.
Yeah, no, I think you've basically covered it, Eric. On the government side, the U.S. government is starting to consider how to deal with this. I think one obstacle we have to overcome is we want to do this together with our allies and partners. The Europeans are in a very different place with their GDPR and their much more risk-oriented kind of, much more stringent regulatory approach to controlling these things. Whereas my understanding is it's a bit more of the Wild West here in the United States. So I think we still have a lot of work to do at the political level to align the Europeans and the Americans so that we can move together forward from a position of strength and maximize, economies of scale in our digital economies in order to compete with China.
Damien, I want to turn to you. This is an incredibly you're on the spot. It's going to be an incredibly consequential year for the Chinese Communist Party, particularly with the Party Congress upcoming. But there's been a lot of volatility that certainly has been reported in the press in terms of regulatory volatility, lurches in the market back and forth. I guess I have a two-part question for you. One is, how are elites in China responding to this regulatory lurch back and forth on a variety of sectors? I mean, from tutoring in the academic sector to tech companies. I mean, it really runs the gamut. So I guess, what is the elite mood to the extent you perceive it? And secondly, because you're loaded with real estate statistics, I'd love for you to share with the audience, how is priming the pump, which is a tried and true CCP approach to macroeconomic impetus, is that going to work?
Yep. Well, Ricky, I got some property stats just for you. So, no. So the first question, tech crackdown. It was, for those who watched it closely, it was definitely coming, but I think markets and investors did not anticipate certainly the ferocity with which it was pursued. We have a lot of debates here about regulating our big tech as well. But obviously we move at a very different pace. But in China, they just went ahead and did it. A lot of people attributed to sort of, this one speech by Jack Ma, but I think, writing was on the wall way before then. It was just a matter of doing it. But I do think they're going to ratchet back a little bit because, the tech crackdown is fundamentally anti-growth because those companies do really well and you're basically eroding a lot of investor wealth if you keep on cracking down on those companies. So in the current environment where they're dealing with COVID lockdown, where their property sector is still quite sluggish from the property crackdown that came before the tech crackdown. Then came the lockdown. So you had 2 crackdowns, and then you had a lockdown. So they're definitely not going to put the foot to the pedal, or pedal to the metal rather, on tech crackdown anymore. And we looked into closely in terms of the actual nature of the crackdown, and we divided the crackdown between 2 types of companies: atoms and bits. Atoms meaning hardware companies, biotech hardware; bits meaning software, app economy, the kind of platform companies that you see. 98% of the tech crackdown fell into bits, so platform companies, app companies, the Facebooks of the world. Only something like 5 companies were in the atoms category. Hard tech, which is what China feels is going to define its technological future. So they were actually carefully calculating this. They were not just cracking down on all tech, right? So 98% of the companies were platform companies that they cracked down on. And part of it was because I think they were getting a lot of really bad complaints from the Chinese public. The reason that the equivalent of a DoorDash or something does really well in China is because labor is really cheap. There are a lot of migrant workers that they did not treat too well, and they were all on their platforms. And so that particular period is over for now. They'll continue to regulate. They definitely want to do more anti-monopoly type of regulations, but they're just not going to be able to tolerate this kind of anti-growth push in this current environment, and they're going to do everything they can to kind of stabilize. We just revised down our second quarter growth for China. We're looking at probably 0% growth in the second quarter.
Wow.
So,
well,
you heard it here first.
Wonderful. We would like to open it up to audience questions. Just before I do that, on behalf of the panel and myself, we're really grateful to the Utah World Trade Center. This has been a remarkable symposium. I hope it recurs in the future. It's I came in expecting to see some former colleagues, and that certainly happened, and made some new friends. And so just incredibly grateful for the opportunity to share some insights and participate. So we have some time, Jim, for audience questions. If that's copacetic with you, I'd like to open it up.
Yes, thank you, Ricky. If you have a question, please raise your hand and shuffle to one side of the aisle. Brighton here from UVU will be bringing you this mic so that those participating on the live stream can hear. And it looks like Andy is our first question.
Yeah.
No, we need it for the live stream.
Andy and I, oddly enough, just met before this, but Andy went to the same high school I did in Lodi, California. So an incredibly small world. I'm glad to see San Joaquin representing here.
Yeah, representing out of California sometimes. But I really appreciated this discussion. I'm curious, you talked a lot about the U.S. needing to jumpstart or restart an industrial policy. One of the challenges that I could see from that is, and it's a strength of our country, but we are a representative republic. And so we have elections that sometimes makes it difficult to have a long-term strategy as a country. Can you talk a little bit about that and how we can overcome those challenges?
Yes, you're absolutely right. That does make it harder to get consensus on some really important things that we should have consensus on, like the CHIPS Act getting more funding to reshore semiconductor production here in the United States. We'd like to see that done sooner rather than later. No, I really think that an industrial strategy for the United States has to double down on our strengths. It's not going to be a Chinese-style industrial strategy. So what are the strengths of the U.S. economy? People from my field, China national security, often really hype China's strengths, and it's a little bit doom and gloom. But the U.S. has tremendous strengths. The largest economy in the world. We're an incredibly diversified, resilient economy. We have plenty of problems, but we bounce back relatively quickly after crises and recessions. The biggest capital markets in the world. One thing that's always missing from conversations about Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese economic initiatives is actually the U.S. accounts for about 40% of global equity markets. It's $49 trillion in our equity markets. And this money flows all over the world wherever there are good investment opportunities. And so that's one of the massive advantages we have, and we need to find ways to have the private sector partner with the government to try to address market failures where there's maybe technology platforms or moonshots that aren't happening because maybe the sort of time horizons don't exactly match up. And that's one thing that my group is trying to think about, how to do that matchmaking and do that horizon scanning. Other advantages we have that we need to exploit are amazing talent, universities, innovation ecosystem. We definitely need to keep attracting talent from around the world, have good immigration policies, so that's really important. But then I think fundamentally the most important strength is our political system, as much as we all like to beat on it. Eric mentioned transparency. So the Chinese system has a lot of advantages, but democracies, at the end of the day, are more transparent, more accountable, and more resilient, and that's what makes us stronger in the end. So I think our industrial strategy has to capitalize on those things in order to kind of get us through these political cycles that are a challenge.
Yeah, I'd actually like to contribute something really quickly. I've asked a lot of questions. Let me just pitch in this one answer to Andy. I think there are natural kind of things in our toolkit that often get talked about: industrial policy, semiconductor, reshoring, friendshoring. My first exposure to public life was when I served on the California State Board of Education, and our remit was K-12. And so you may not really think about K-12 all that often in terms of great power competition, but it's not immaterial. I mean, we need to continue to pump out more STEM graduates. We need to emphasize disciplines that have real returns in our economy, that focus on the technologies of tomorrow. I can't speak for my fellow panelists. I'll speak for myself. We need to reinvigorate K-12 education in this country. There's too many kids falling through the cracks. It's not just rural America, it's urban America, places in between, places where you and I were raised. And without a family foundation, some kids get lost, right? The second thing is also vocational education may not necessarily, and I'm going to build a bridge to the political polarization that I think is crippling the United States, and I've talked about it with some of my colleagues here, but we kind of forsook vocational education in the United States. I don't know why that happened, but it certainly did, and we de-emphasized skills training. And I'm a real estate developer in California, and I'll tell you, good luck finding a HVAC technician or an electrician. It's hard. I mean, there's a lot of lag time there, and as a result, I think we have lost some ability to properly integrate as many people as possible into the American domestic economy. And some of that spillover is polarization politically. I think there is a connection there to the fractures we see. And then I would double down on soft power. I mean, not to overly personalize things, but this is still a country that people want to gravitate to and move to. It's why my parents moved to the United States. And we should be proud of that, and I'd like to see a little bit more of a reawakening of the fact that you can come here and make the most of your ability here, and we shouldn't shy away from that. We should try to invoke it appropriately.
Let me write on Ricky's coattails just for one bit. I think you got two people from immigrant families sitting here, and I think that's actually a question I've been thinking about for a long time throughout the pandemic. I don't know why. I just thought about. Oh, three. Well, we're all technically from somewhere else, but I'm just saying recent.
Somewhere along the line.
Somewhere along the line, right? But I don't know what it was, but I was thinking a lot about this question of sort of what are core U.S. competitive strength, not just core strength, but strength that other people cannot easily copy or imitate. China, it's easy to copy technology. You can probably eventually get it somehow, somewhere. But inclusiveness is not something that can be copied very easily for any other country. It really can't, because it requires a whole society way of doing things, a norm, a culture that doesn't exist really anywhere else that I've seen. China's certainly not going to be that. So, and through inclusiveness comes creativity and innovation. That's how it works. And so I think that part is something that we really need to think a little bit harder about. Kind of the sort of the software that makes America, right? So.
Right here in the center aisle.
Thanks. Dave Politis with Silicon Slopes. So let's get real tactical. From an economic statecraft standpoint, should we cut back on H-1B1 visas for Chinese nationals? given the way the CCP views individuals who are Chinese as being, what was the term that you found, Eric, on your, you pointed on your website? The idea that they're actually support the state, is that right?
I think you're talking about some of the laws of
Yeah,
all of society.
exactly.
Yeah, right.
Should
yeah.
we cut back on H-1B1?
You know, personally, I don't think so. I think we need to
Okay.
ramp them up. I actually love what the Biden administration did. Even we were talking about Russia earlier, opening up new visa programs essentially for Russian STEM folks to come here. I don't think we need to cut back. I think it's the opposite. We need to ramp up, especially if we do have sound policy around the fourth industrial revolution and actually wanting to compete and win in these emerging technologies. We need all the talent we can get. I think there are way too many students that come here, get educated here, want to stay here and want to work here, but can't because of the H-1B quota. So I think that there needs to be reform in that.
I agree with Eric. You know, I want us to keep attracting the best STEM talent from around the world. The Trump administration did put in place some visa policies to block people with association with the People's Liberation Army from coming to this country. I think when the State Department did the research, they found that it affected about 1.5% of Chinese visa applicants who were going to university and graduate school. So it was a very tiny percentage with known documented affiliation with the People's Liberation Army coming to the US to study things like hypersonic missile technology, take that back and use that to develop you know, rockets to attack the United States. So I'm certainly in favor of blocking people like that, but they're a very tiny percentage, and I want the rest of the really great STEM talent.
We shouldn't help the Chinese government reverse the brain drain. We shouldn't help it.
Yeah.
Far side. You're getting your steps in.
Oh, yeah. So my question's for Eric. You talked about data as a means of production in this kind of new economic environment. And I was wondering, given that China has far greater access to data as a surveillance state, in the foreseeable future, does that turn the U.S. into like not having a competitive advantage or always being behind China?
I think the question here, if I could rephrase it a little bit, is the government's ability to compete. Is that what you're gonna?
Yeah, just like their ability to gather data.
Right. So I think like in the United States, one of the things that I mean, we have a ton of data in industry. How is it harnessed vis-a-vis China is quite different. I do think that the government is actively engaged in data collection globally. That's well known, well documented. The Chinese government is going after data everywhere. Some people think that it's a land grab so that they can just collect it, let it sit, and then analyze it later on as more technical capabilities get developed. But they are using it in AI models. They're using it in all sorts of things. The U.S. government, you know, has a different approach to that. There is no, you know, development of critical technologies in the government that are leveraging that type of data globally to compete at that level. I think we need to harness it for industry, but I don't think that it necessarily creates a competitive disadvantage for the United States because, you know, as I agree with Liza, you know, she just laid out all of the realities of the U.S. Position, which is we have the largest economy in the world, largest capital market, most advanced innovation ecosystem. That's where that data is housed and being used. And in the context of economic statecraft, that's where the innovation is happening. So I don't think that puts us at a disadvantage. And you know, when you talk about industrial policy, we need data to be part of that economic statecraft and industrial policy in the US, but I don't think that it needs to obviously have as much government intervention in. I think actually government just needs to send signals. And I think the lighter the touch, but by providing clear direction of where industry should go in relationship to economic statecraft, we'll mobilize industry to that and then leverage the data to go ahead and do that. So that's my sense. I hope that answered your question.
You know, something that was stated early on, I think it was the panel this morning, was obviously we do not have conventionally understood a sovereign wealth fund in our country, right? We don't have one. Many other countries do. And I think part of economic statecraft intersecting with diplomacy is when we see an investment need where there's a geopolitical component, and those examples crop up in the government all the time, we need to do a better job of mobilizing friends in industry. And if we can't do that, going to sovereign wealth funds of like-minded states or partners, and I think that is a part of our diplomatic toolkit, it would behoove us to kind of build out. I think we got time for one more question, Jim. Yeah. In the back.
This might be the elephant in the room, but I was just curious to know, with some research talking about gain of function research being the source of the COVID virus, what on the ground in China with kind of the public, what are their attitudes towards the U.S. When sort of the public, the media was blaming China for the COVID virus and then this alternative possible source? Is that, does that interfere with some of these negotiations and our trade relations? Or do you know? I mean, are people, it's been kind of closed for a couple of years, so I'm just wondering really how that's impacting the business exchanges.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I can't offer on the ground insights into Chinese citizens' views, but just sort of from living through that episode from the White House perspective, what we saw was actually early on in the pandemic, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda apparatus, shifting the blame for the pandemic to the United States very early on. And so regardless of whether you believe it started in a lab or a wet market or whatever, we'll probably never know because all the evidence has been shifted away and the party has blocked outside investigators, so we'll never know. But very early on, we observed that their propaganda apparatus was going into overdrive to put the blame on the U.S. They tried to start a rumor about it starting in an Army lab here in the United States, and things like that. So that was the narrative that was being fed to the Chinese population and to the world. I don't have any insight into what the uptake of that was, whether they believed it or not. But the world kind of moved on after that. I would say that in general, should we be cooperating and exchanging information with the Chinese government about these global challenges like pandemics? Yes, absolutely. I mean, even though we've gone in this direction of strategic competition, I think our first best outcome would always be if the United States and China could cooperate on global issues. That is absolutely the outcome we would hope for. Time and time again, however, when the United States government has reached out its hand or offered, we haven't gotten a positive response. So in the case of global health cooperation, it's something to continue to pursue. However, it's really hard to put that in a cooperative light when we see the Chinese government committing cyber theft against our labs, trying to steal the IP for the vaccines under development, the treatments under development, which was also a development we saw early on in the pandemic. It's hard to then go back and say this is a cooperative relationship. But I don't know if you have any more current insights on Chinese views on the ground. But
Don't hate us, Jim. Is there one other question here in the front? We have about 1 minute, so we'll be quick.
Make it fast.
I guess I'll pose it as a question rather than a statement. The thought comes to me isn't our greatest, my concern is that as a people we voice our ability to see things, but then we continue on in a little bit of an arrogance that's going to be detrimental to us. And that's my concern with us saying our position is so much stronger, not very long, if we don't take it seriously today, which I appreciated Mr. Huntsman's statement, closing statement this morning. Powerful, strong. I guess that as a question, isn't that our greatest strength, is to recognize the risk and aggressively pursue it now?
Yes. Yes.
100%, yeah.
Thank you all for joining us. Jim, you've got